Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Silva. Thank you for joining me. What if I told you your feelings aren't just reactions to what's happening around you? That they actually have much more to do with the balance of neurotransmitters in the central nervous system than the environment? That internal conditions matter more than external conditions most of the time. Stay with me as I explore how your emotions might be more about brain chemistry than the stories we tell ourselves. Narratives with an agenda that are subjective at best, that are born of those chemical reactions, and which are vulnerable to the machinations of unconscious or preconscious defense mechanisms. If you like what you hear, please take 2 seconds to hit that like button so that other people will be more likely to find this video. I'm still a needle in a haystack. My patients talk about their emotions, and they often misattribute their causes, why they feel what they feel, overemphasizing external events and ignoring their own reactions. I often have to educate them about the source of their feelings, especially if it's a symptom, why it has the character that it has and why the intensity. What I often have to point out to them, what they're almost always universally and unwittingly doing, is rationalizing their emotions, inappropriately using logic to try to explain why they feel what they feel, when logic often has nothing to do with it, and giving too much credit to environmental triggers rather than realizing that those external triggers are just that, mere triggers. The first domino that begins a cascade of neuronal activity that's the reaction to that trigger, which is unique to each individual and much more important. Neuronal activity leading to emotions that the individual is predisposed to experience. That external domino is not the actual root cause of the emotion. If it's a symptom, it's not the etiology of the symptom. No matter how you look at it, the ultimate source of the emotion is always you. Emotions come from within. It's like that horror movie, the call is coming from inside the house.
We traced the call. It's coming from inside the house. You hear me? It's coming from inside the house.
This is especially true for anxiety and irritability. Not all individuals react to a stressor in the same way. The same domino can provoke one emotion in person A and another diametrically opposed emotion in person B, or no emotional response at all in person C, who might be heavily medicated. How can that be if the cause of the emotion is the domino? It turns out the cascade is way more important. It's way more important whether or not you're sober, for example, in the face of whatever triggers. That's an extreme example, but barring chemical dependency, you're still a slave to your own neurotransmitters and hormones, even if you're not abusing drugs. Every experience we have as physical, mortal beings is steeped in biochemistry and neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, because it's the internal cascade that enables the emotion in the first place. Without it, no emotion is possible. So that setup is usually what matters more. I say usually because if someone dies, or you lose a limb, or your livelihood, or your partner asks for a divorce, or the house burns down, fine. In those instances, perhaps it's fair to say that the consequent grief is because of the tragic event. But excluding grief, almost every other time, it's not the external event. It's not the domino. It's how we react. And certainly when that reaction is extreme, when it's a panic attack or a fit of rage, we can all see and agree and understand the symptomatic nature of the emotion and consequent behavior. That there must be something wrong with the individual because they're experiencing a symptom. But this phenomenon is also true further down along the spectrum for all of us, most of the time, even with less intense anxiety or anger. Irritability is a good example. When you're irritable, it's because of brain chemistry. Why are you irritable? Because there's something wrong with your brain, something wrong in the central nervous system. And it can be due to a variety of chemical influences, but the final common pathway involves the neurotransmitters. When you're irritable, you're not just overreacting to things that would frustrate anyone. Frustration tolerance itself is impaired. The physical threshold for feeling annoyed at all is lowered, such that you're getting angry about things that don't even usually make you angry. Little obstacles that ordinarily wouldn't even occur to you to get mad about. And it's just one more thing. Well, of course it's one more thing, because it's more or less everything for that period. It all comes down to the chemical environment. Irritability is not logical. Emotions are not logical, even when they seem to make sense. They're really not amenable to logical deconstruction. I always say emotions are irrational by definition. One actual definition I found stated that emotion is, quote, instinctive or intuitive feeling, as distinguished from reasoning or knowledge. When I say that emotions are irrational, I'm talking about the emotions themselves. We may very well be able to use cause and effect logical arguments in describing the relationship between the triggers and the emotion, and place all of that in the context of an individual's history, their experiences, their culture, their beliefs and biases. All of that matters, but the emotions themselves are not rational entities. They're not thought. They lead to thought, and it goes in the other direction too. Thought can engender emotion. That's the crux of cognitive behavioral therapy. But emotions have to be translated into thought. They're not equivalent. Emotions are not thought, nor vice versa. That's why it's difficult to describe their essence. It's easier to describe the, quote, reason you're angry because such and such happened and so did this and that, i.e. the triggers, than it is to describe the feeling of anger itself. Ever try it? Try explaining anger in words without using synonyms. What anger feels like, what it actually feels like. You can't. You can describe the physical correlates, the heart races, the pupils dilate, the muscles tense, that little vein on your forehead starts bulging, but those are the physical manifestations of the fight or flight response. They aren't the subjective experience of the emotion itself, anger itself. That's ineffable. It's beyond words. It's like music. You can set music to lyrics, but try describing the music itself. That's what rationalizing the emotions is, setting music to lyrics. But the lyrics, the thoughts, are not the music. And again, I'm not talking about the physical sounds. We have words for how brassy or reedy instrument sounds are, how loud and soft, how much vibrato. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about music's inherent essence, what we might call its mood, without synonyms like happy or ominous. What is happy? Describe the feeling of happiness, of dread, without synonyms. We don't have words for that because we're not describing something that's rational. In my view, emotionality almost always comes first. It's the foundation, which is why we have to train our brains to go the other way when we do therapy. We don't have to learn it when emotion is reflexive, instinctive, and immediate the way it is, when emotion engenders thought, and that leads to beliefs and behaviors. That's usually the direction it takes. It's neuronal firing in one area of the brain, say the fear circuits of the amygdala, and then lightning fast, in response to actual electrochemical circuitry, a separate, distinct discharge in a distant lobe, the neocortex, for example, where thought and shields like rationalization and denial live. These phenomena, thoughts and emotions, share a basic neurophysiology, but the epiphenomena themselves are fundamentally different. And in my opinion, at least, in my philosophy, emotions are inherently irrational, even when they're not symptoms. They simply don't obey the rules of logic. They're not objective, they're not explicit, they're not quantifiable. They just are. So if you try to make sense of them logically, you're either going to frustrate yourself or mislead yourself. You're irritable, so you blame the triggers for irritating you. But they're not irritating you, you're already irritable. What's irritating you is plunging levels of neurosteroids like estrogen and progesterone during the late luteal phase of your cycle, if you're a woman of childbearing age, or the testosterone cream you slather on every day if you're a bodybuilder. Or maybe you're hungry, hormones again, or sleep deprived. You woke up on the wrong side of the bed, that's what's wrong with you. But we're so ready to blame the environment for the way in which we're reacting to it. Not everybody feels overwhelmed by a given stressor to the point of not being able to breathe. Most people, in fact, do not experience outright panic in the face of garden variety quotidian stressors that actually aren't life and death situations. But some people do. Some people with social anxiety disorder panic walking into a party if they're alone and they don't know anybody. And that's because a primitive instinct has gone terribly awry. Instinct being the key term. Emotions have evolutionary significance. They're ancient, and we evolved them because they kept us alive. That's all they were originally intended to do. Fear and aggression evolved in parallel, the fight or flight freeze phenomenon, because it conveyed a survival advantage. Animals move around, and they eat each other, and need to mate with one another, so those systems emerged. Whereas plants don't feel emotions, as far as we know, because they don't need them. They don't need them to send out roots and soak up water and lean into the sunlight. Nature didn't evolve angry foliage because, unlike animals, anger wouldn't help the bush in its quest for survival. And so natural selection didn't come into play. Why do we get scared? Because it keeps us alive. But walking into a party, there's no reason for that reaction. A pounding heart and sweaty palms are not only unnecessary, they actually make things worse. when the goal is to relax and socialize and not have everybody know how uptight you feel. That just makes it worse, a huge snowball. Today, even when the emotion isn't inappropriate, a lot of it is inessential to survival in today's modern world. Lions and tigers and bears don't roam the city streets. We've rounded them up. And so more often than not, those primitive responses that are so deeply ingrained are out of place and out of order in a civilized world. More often than not, emotions distract and derail us. We certainly enjoy some of them, but the not-so-pleasant ones are almost always unnecessary. And when they're intense, they're symptoms. Rage is a symptom. Irritability is a symptom. Anxiety is a symptom. Phobias, panic, performance anxiety, avoidant behavior, violence, they're not logical. It's not rational. Much of the time we can't help it. We're born with those neural networks. It's written into our DNA. And some of us experience clinically relevant explosions of emotion that are truly debilitating or even dangerous to ourselves and others, and entirely unnecessary. So the next time you start panicking over a situation that's not literally life or death, and you want to know why the panic, the why is because your neural networks are going haywire. But the ultimate reason, the reason those fear circuits are there in the first place, is still survival. One could rationalize that the, air quotes, reason for flop sweat and the trembling hands that make us fumble our index cards and the quaver in our voice and stammering and stuttering are because we're giving a speech. That seems logical on the surface. Those symptoms are because we're giving a speech. But why are we sweating bullets and shaking as though we were standing on a precipice during an earthquake about to fall into a ravine? If that were really happening, we would need all of that extra energy and muscle power and sharp eyesight that surges of adrenaline provide. That's not happening. Addressing an audience is not a life or death situation, so why is the body reacting as though it were? It's irrational. It's an inappropriate emotional response rife with physical symptoms. But we can't say that the cause is giving the speech because another person giving that speech would not react that way. Some people are vulnerable to it. Others are not. Those that are not prove that it's not the speech. Those symptoms occur at the podium because the person is anxious. And they're anxious because they're anxious, not because they're giving a speech. It tends to run in families. Either mom or dad or both likewise suffered from glossophobia. The speech is the trigger, but speeches don't cause nervousness. If they did, everybody would suffer speech anxiety. Those individuals are predisposed to that particular irrational fear. The cause is internal. Performance anxiety. That's what we call it. And sure, it hinges upon any number of psychological variables. It's always a combination of nature and nurture, right? And we can hunt down those psychological factors and elaborate all kinds of logical explanations and theories for why those who are morbidly afraid of being scrutinized and humiliated experience surges of noradrenaline. And all of that excess norepinephrine explains the sweating and trembling and quavering and quaking, the outward signs. But it's not the soliloquy that's causing the stage fright. That's a rationalization. If we want to know the true cause, we have to take a look at the family history. It's in the genes. And in my opinion, with regard to anxiety, nature far outweighs nurture. Whether a person qualifies for a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder or social phobia or not, whatever we call it, it's in the genes when it's clinically relevant anxiety. Whether you have a condition or just a few mild to moderate symptoms, whether you need medication or just a few deep breaths and a little self-soothing, it's in the genes. I feel very strongly about that. I'm talking about a predisposition, a vulnerability. The specific flavor it takes, that can be more the nurture piece. Your experiences, your culture, how you were raised, what you were raised to believe. But those are the lyrics. Don't get distracted by the lyrics, by the meaning we superimpose on the way we feel. If we're being purists and we're talking about the feeling itself, that gets translated into all of these irrational thoughts. Oh, I'm going to be humiliated. I'm going to be humiliated. And so what if you are? It's not the end of the world. Oh, but it does feel like the end of the world. It is the end of the world. It might as well be. That's your subjective reality. If you want to understand the nature of the emotion, look no further than nature itself. Why the person is nervous might have any number of rationalized explanations. Oh, because the person was humiliated as a child once giving a speech, blah, blah, blah. We can come up with lots of explanations for why that on the surface seem accurate and logical. But panic in those situations is anything but logical. The reality is closer to the guy's father suffered from social phobia and generalized anxiety and also experienced performance anxiety and handed down those genes, that predisposition to unhealthy reactions and behaviors in those contexts. I'm not saying the context doesn't matter, but without the vulnerability, the context wouldn't matter. I'm saying it matters less, in my opinion, in my professional opinion. Now, I'm not going to get into the nature-nurture argument here. Obviously, I'm biased toward the nature side because I see how not everybody is vulnerable, including between siblings who presumably were nurtured the same way. And for those that are, all of it changes with serotonin reuptake inhibitors or medications that enhance the actions of GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, like Xanax. But of course, I am admitting here, for the record, it's always a combination of heredity and experience. The larger point is simply that when the fight or flight system is triggered, the story leading up to that first domino really doesn't matter anymore. Why the domino is what it is, and where it is, and how it came to be are largely irrelevant concerns once the panic gets started, because all of that history and psychology and all of those tidy explanations only pertain to that first domino. The rest of the cascade is theoretically nearly identical for anyone having a panic attack, or someone who's apoplectic with rage, because we're talking about the brain and the adrenal glands. We're talking about hormones and neurotransmitters. Millions of years of evolution have seen to that. It's like digestion. We all process carbohydrates and fats and proteins in pretty much the same way. Some of us are better at handling gluten or lactose given, but mammalian physiology is mammalian physiology. Not everyone has a peanut allergy, but those that do, likewise have the same broken mechanism, the same internal system gone awry. And here I'm talking about the immune system, obviously. If we're talking about feeling, emotion itself, the narrative doesn't matter. I want to say that again. When we get down to the emotion itself, particularly extreme emotions that are symptoms, the narrative doesn't matter. The details don't help us to better understand or explain emotionality itself, its character, its intensity, its duration, the physical manifestations of something that is itself a physical phenomenon, even when we don't experience it as anything physical, even when we aren't shaking or sweating or blushing, even when it's ephemeral and ethereal, just the feeling itself. It's still neurons, electrical signals, chemical messengers, but people want to explain why. It's human nature, and they often get it wrong. Another part of the brain wants to make sense of it, just automatically tries to make sense of it, and mistakes the ultimate cause and effect. When a person can't rationalize it, when they can't find a reason, or at least a good enough reason, a patient with a severe aberration of serotonergic neurotransmission, theoretically, will often ask me why. Why do I feel this way? Why am I reacting like this? Why am I crying for no reason? Why am I panicking? Why am I waking up into panic? And I tell them there is no why, not the kind of why they're seeking. They don't know it, but they're seeking a rationalization. The why is chemistry. There is no other why. It's not a useful question in those cases. The rationalization certainly isn't going to change anything. The false understanding won't change anything. Even cognitive behavioral therapy will fail if they have it wrong, if they need medicine. It's actually easier when the triggers aren't obvious, spontaneous panic attacks and crying jags for no apparent reason, because then the patient can't reach for a rationalization, because then the symptom is obviously irrational. Rationalization is often thought of as a defense mechanism. It's not always. I'm not always talking about a defense mechanism here when I talk about rationalization, but when it is a defense against threatening or unacceptable thoughts, feelings, impulses, urges, etc., people don't know they're doing it most of the time. At least not in the immediate moment, usually. Freud was the first to propose unconscious or preconscious defense mechanisms, which were among the few Freudian concepts that have withstood the test of time. Most of Freud's theories have been discredited. Penis envy, anyone? But the idea of creating plausible but false reasons to explain our actions or attitudes that are actually due to unrecognized motives was first proposed by a Welsh neurologist and psychoanalyst, a lifelong friend of Freud and his eventual biographer, Alfred Ernest Jones, who wrote The Life and Work of Sigmund Freud, a 3-volume biography published over the course of several years. Jones, who has the distinction of being the first psychoanalyst to speak English, he was instrumental in promulgating psychoanalysis to the English-speaking world, coined the term rationalization in 1908 in an article entitled Rationalization in Everyday Life. He defined the phenomenon as a purely unconscious mental manipulation with the aim of providing a logical account of oneself. Rationalizations can be for the benefit of others, and social pressures often bring them about, but a person also rationalizes in their own mind to convince themselves, to explain their feelings and motives to themselves in non-threatening terms, because unconsciously, the truth is unsettling, it's threatening. So the mind automatically makes an excuse. But the term was taken up almost immediately by Freud and later his daughter, Anna Freud, expanded upon the concept. Freud incorporated the concept into his theory of psychoanalysis, explaining Rationalisierung as an unconscious process designed to protect the ego, justifying behavior, thoughts, or emotions specifically to avoid anxiety, guilt, or shame. And he used it to explain the neurotic behavior of his patients. Ernest Jones defined it simply as, quote, the inventing of a reason for an attitude or action, the motive of which is not recognized. And the key to that explanation, in addition to being non-threatening, is that it seems plausible. And the attendant facts are usually incontrovertible, but they're also irrelevant. It's an excuse. It may be true, but it's not the real reason. Now, that's rationalization, the defense mechanism. It's not always a defense. Sometimes the underlying reasons are not so threatening. They're nonetheless largely unknown, and a person is largely unaware that they're doing it unless they have cultivated some insight and they can catch themselves. That's what's meant by preconscious, where you kind of sort of know that you're trying to talk yourself into it, but you're not focusing on it fully. And then there are other people where it's completely unconscious. It's automatic and they don't see it. It has to be pointed out to them. I do it all the time. I call it my superpower, and I'm really good at calling myself on it. But when the mind needs to make sense of something, it can only work with what it knows, or what it thinks it knows. The important thing to understand is that the rationalization may be perfectly true. A lot of times when patients are rationalizing to me, they're giving me facts. The rationalization may be perfectly true, in fact, and even, on the surface at least, seemingly intimately related to the symptom in question, because the association between the trigger and the feeling is tight. It's logical. That makes sense, including in the context of the person's life experience, their culture, their beliefs, etc. But the explanation is otherwise largely irrelevant. What's important is the reaction, not the trigger, when we're talking about extremes of emotion, symptoms. They're irrational. And so any explanation about the trigger so-and-so and such is a narrative. It really doesn't have anything to do with the emotion itself when we're here up in the brain and neurons are firing and neurotransmitters are being released, because it's not a uniform reaction in all individuals with brains. So it's something about that individual. Why is this person getting mad, but this person isn't? Why is this person panicking, this person isn't? Why is this person crying, and this person isn't? Why does this person cry some of the time in response to those stressors, but not in others? It varies. It waxes and wanes because our chemical environment in the central nervous system waxes and wanes. Patients can rarely be perfectly objective anyway. We all have a blind spot for ourselves. So explaining our emotions can be a tricky thing. Acknowledging them can be tricky. Other phenomena exist, like denial and minimization and compartmentalization. Those are actual defenses. We often have to wade through a lot, only to still focus overly much on triggers. So in treating extreme, excessive, or blatantly irrational emotional responses, I don't encourage patients to dissect them rationally because of the risk of rationalization. It's the best we can do. Getting it totally wrong and being distracted by something that may have significance or meaning in a different context, but that doesn't explain the emotional reaction at its physiological core. It's really not all that useful in treating the target symptoms, not when we need medication, anyway. It's not completely useless to examine the triggers. One can try to avoid them, but what if the problem follows you around, as symptoms tend to do? What if you're angry and everything triggers you? What if your partner triggers you? Rationalization can lead to misguided blame, blaming innocent people, bystanders that tend to be family and friends. Rationalization can lead to gnashing one's teeth, agonizing over deducing a good reason that doesn't exist. There's a cause, but it's not reasonable, and it's neither good nor bad. Like the emotional reaction, it just is. First, we must accept that it just is. Suffering is refusing to accept what is, and so to suffer as little as possible, coming to accept what already is the first step to a more easygoing, fulfilling life. That's enough for now. Please join me in part 2 as I continue this discussion about the Jedi mind trick known as rationalization. As always, questions and comments are welcome.